Any questions before we start? Everybody's having fun with coursework 1. The due date was last Friday. Oh, there's a submission link on Moodle now to coursework 1. So you can, it's open for submissions. It's a Microsoft form, so you fill out a Microsoft form. It asks you for your name, your student number, the DOI of the paper you're submitting, and the author that's from the University of Nottingham on there, just so you know, and of course the URL.
Question about the authors. So my paper has 3 authors, and one author is the current staff in the university, is a professor. Another author is a PhD student, candidate.
You can put all the authors that are at the university. Yeah. At least one of them should be from the university. Question?
I have submitted twice for the form because for the first time I submitted the link that the video is not that good. I didn't put any text on the video. And for second part, for second submit, I put a video with text on that. So will you accept this kind of submit?
Yeah, it does allow multiple submissions. Yes, it
so
does.
you will take a look at the last one, right?
Yes, we will take a look at the last one. If you do submit multiple times, just make sure we assess the right one.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? Please don't abuse the multiple submission function and submit like 10 times or something. Yeah. Any other questions? I have a suggestion, by the way. I should have suggested this earlier. Some people have asked me for help with their research papers, and I looked at the research papers and I tried to extract the concept and those sorts of things. Really, if somebody showed me a really difficult paper last Friday, and I wouldn't say I was struggling to get the information out of it, but it took me, like it was not easy for me. So feel free to look at like 4 or 5 different research papers. You don't have to like choose the most difficult one, right? You can look at any number you want and then say, oh, this one looks more understandable than this one, so I will summarize this one, which is more understandable, right? You don't have to choose the most difficult, strangest research paper, right? Some are more understandable than others, and some are more clear than others, some are more well written than others, some have more nice figures than others. Question?
Were we limited to like a range when the paper should be thrown to?
The goal is that one of the authors should be currently working in the School of Computer Science. So as long as that's true, it should be fine.
So if the paper's from like 2010?
That's fine, yeah. As long as one of the... Do you guys understand one of the goals of this exercise is that you become familiar with the staff's work, because you're trying to choose a supervisor, right? That's all connected. And somebody fooled me, and they said, is this paper okay? And both of the authors were not affiliated with the school at the time. It was published in like 2015. But now they are. And I was like, oh, okay. So maybe, you know, when you submit it and you're putting the authors from the university down, you might put a note that says, by the way, they weren't employed at the university in 2016 when this paper was published. just to give me a heads up. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, if anybody does have questions, just feel free to raise your hand or interrupt at any time. I'm going to try to go through this material without wasting too much time because I don't think it's very difficult. So we're going to talk about interviews and focus groups today, 2 qualitative research methods, right? So interviews are a common qualitative research method, right? You can ask an expert or you can ask a non-expert, you can ask anybody questions about any topic, research topic. And usually you're recording the interviews. And usually the recording is transcribed, and then you try to analyze the text. You're trying to pick out themes, outliers, patterns, and trends, similar to qualitative in some ways, research. So what is the purpose of an interview? An interview should have some sort of a goal, right, or a purpose. And that's something that you would explain or at least mention on a very high level at the beginning of the interview. It could be something like, the goal of this interview is to get your opinion on the following topic. But you don't want to be too specific, right, because you might bias the interviewee, right? You don't want to say, I'm trying to get you to say, I'm trying to get you to agree with my opinion on this topic. Like, you don't want to start the interview that way. Then you also explain the structure of an interview, right? How long it's going to take, maybe how many questions there are. And then you also mention how the data will be used. The data is usually anonymized, right? So the name of the interviewee is never published. So usually the interviews are recorded and transcribed and anonymized. And oftentimes, quotes are used from those interviews to support a research question or hypothesis. And you might want to say to the interviewee how you're going to use that data, like how is it going to be analyzed and so on, although they're usually not very interested in that. I've also had cases where people say, can I have a recording of my interview back? Right? Or the transcription of my interview back. There are different kinds of interviews, right? There are interviews that follow a very strict structure, right? 10 questions and no deviations from those questions. Even if it's unnatural, it's still very strict and structured. These are probably not the most popular choice. Semi-structured interviews have some overlap, but they allow a person to go off on a tangent to start talking about a different topic that might not be included in that strict structure. So it has a set of questions, it has structure, but it allows somebody to go off in a different direction and talk about other topics that were not originally planned or not originally intended in the interview. And then there are, of course, unstructured and conversational interviews where it's very much improvised. You just choose a topic to talk about, and then away you go. That's unusual. This is not something I would usually recommend for a research study, a completely unstructured interview. Usually you have special questions that you're trying to get out of somebody. You're trying to get their experience out. So if you're testing some software, you say, do you think this feature is useful? And they might say no or yes. And then you say, well, if yes, why do you think it's useful? So you're really trying to extract very specific information, right? That might not happen in an unstructured or conversational interview. There are different types of questions, so-called factual questions. Are you familiar with using Moodle? for example, that's a yes or no question, generally speaking. Tell me how you use Moodle in a typical day's study. That's a narrative question. So it's asking people to describe their experience. Opinions. Do you think Moodle is a good piece of software, for example? What's your opinion? Ideas. If you were to improve Moodle, what are the features that you wish would be there that are not there now? And maybe some suggestions for improvements or follow-up, right? So those are follow-up questions are like the one example I gave, like, do you think this feature is useful? No. Why don't you think this feature is useful? That's a follow-up question. I found in my personal experience, the follow-up questions are the most important questions, actually. Because you can ask somebody if a feature is useful, and typically the answer will be yes or no. And then if you don't have a follow-up question, the conversation just moves to the next topic. So the follow-up questions are, in my opinion, are the most important, super important. Some guidelines on interviews is to stay consistent, right? To make sure all of your questions are formulated exactly the same, right? Changing the questions introduces a new variable into the data set, so to speak. You can focus on questions that have an open-ended answer, and don't expect a closed factual question to lead to opinion-based answers. So those closed questions, those are yes or no questions, true or false. Those require generally a follow-up, right? If you start with a closed question, yes or no, you want to immediately have a follow-up question. Why do you think this? You know, why did you answer yes, or why did you answer no? Why do you think this is good, or why do you think this is bad? And there may be more follow-up questions, right? They might say something like, oh, because I found a pattern. Why do you think this feature is good? Because I found a pattern using this feature. And then you would ask, what pattern did you find? Right? So the follow-up questions are super important. Avoid vague questions like, what do you think about the software? You can make those much more specific, like, does the software actually help you to perform this special task more easily, right? You can mix and match factual questions with subjective questions to get people's opinions. You can ask unusual questions in a semi-structured interview. And you're also allowed to give the interviewee time to think. So that's fine. I think everybody understands this. This is not the world's most deep intellectual kind of scientific discussion. You can also ask neutral questions. Tell me what has been good and what the bad points of online learning. Do you agree with me that online learning has been a disaster for everyone involved? So that's a very biased question, isn't it? The second one. The first one is a little bit more objective, and then the second one is really like saying, I'm trying to get you to agree with me on this point. And you don't want to bias the direction of the answer, right? It's very easy to set up biased interviews. Has anybody noticed this? Right? It's really easy. And it's not so easy to set up a really objective interview. It's really difficult, actually. So it's a good exercise to look at the bias of an interview, right? Try to use neutral prompts and encouraging verbal cues, and be a good listener. And I think interruption, probably I should have put something about interruption here. Like when somebody's speaking, don't interrupt them. That's what, if you're asking those follow-up questions, that means you're a good listener. Like you're really listening to them, you're paying attention, and you're asking the follow-up questions. Try not to suggest that some answers are more correct than others. Ask for clarification. Those are the follow-up questions, right? If they say something very vague, like they use the pronoun we, then you might want to ask, okay, who is we? Who else was involved in this experiment? And then the why, right? Who and why? Very important follow-up questions. Also, make sure to clarify any special terminology you're using. You might be using some terminology that is not familiar with the interviewee. And ask them if they understand the question, of course. So you can divide your interview into different sections and different themes. You might have a topic that says, okay, I'm going to ask you about your background first. So I have 5 questions about your background, who you are, your age group, and so on, what your area of expertise is. And then the next set of 5 questions might be, okay, now we're going to ask you specifically about this piece of software and how well you thought it was designed, for example. And you can start with easy questions and make them more complicated as you go along. And of course, one question at a time is a good guideline. And then ending the interview. So usually the ending of the interview, you let them know. You ask an open-ended question that lets them say anything that's on their mind. Right? Maybe they have some opinion or something they want to share that wasn't covered by one of your questions. So you can ask a very open-ended question at the end. Do you have any other thing that you want to report on? Do you have any other opinions? Do you have anything you'd like to discuss that you think I missed? You know, you can make that very explicit. Are there any questions you wish that I had asked? That's a fun one, right? And then you can let them know what happens next. You know, you can give them a timeline that says, okay, I'm going to try to interview 10 more people over the next 10 weeks. Not 10 weeks, 2 weeks. And then I'm going to try to spend a few weeks analyzing the results, and then I'll have the results of my analysis in 6 weeks or something. Question?
If you find out there's some question you could ask, can you ask next in the next interview?
So he asked, if you forgot something or you want to add additional questions, can you ask again in the next interview? I can say that if you've set up your experiment from the very beginning to include that second interview, it should be fine. But if you didn't set up your experiment to include 2 meetings, then it's going to be very difficult, generally speaking. It's still possible, but it's going to be difficult. If you think you're going to have 2 interviews, you want to try to know that before the whole thing starts. And anybody know how you might discover that? Like imagine you're doing an interview and you think, oh my gosh, I really should have set this up to have 2 parts. Anybody know how you might discover that kind of information or flaw or modification?
Ask those questions to experts.
Talk to your supervisor. Yep. That's always a good piece of advice. You run a pilot study or a pilot test interview. You do a few tests. Run it on an experimental basis with a few experimental interviewees. See if it works, and then if you think it works, go with it. But usually in the pilot tests, you discover problems. That's the whole point of a pilot test or a pilot interview, to discover problems like, oh, this interview isn't going to work just in one sitting. I need to modify it. And by the way, there's another thing that I always ask too is, do you have any questions for me? Right? I say that at the beginning of every lecture, and at the end of every lecture, at the end of every interview, and so on. Right? And by the way, this should look familiar to you. This could also say ending the job interview, right? When you're interviewing for a job. It's the same thing. They will always ask you, do you have any questions for us? And you should have some ready. I have a video on job interviews if anybody's interested. It's on my YouTube channel. Okay, practicalities. Remember to ask for permission to record the interview. This business of transcribing has gotten much easier in the recent years. It used to be that you had to sit down and do transcriptions by hand manually, which was very time-consuming. But now there's lots of software that will do good transcriptions for you, right? Like Teams does quite a good transcription. I think YouTube does quite a good transcription too, and probably there are some other pieces of software that I don't know about that do very good transcriptions. However, they're not perfect. You might have to go through and make some modifications, right, to get them a little bit more accurate. And you can usually leave out things like stammering. Right, if somebody says you're usually leaving that out, unless the interview is really to capture those things. I was interviewed once by a journalist, and they left in every single like and and they left it in the interview, like, and it got published with those strange like sounds in it. I was like, really? Yeah. And of course, there are software tools to analyze interviews, right? And one of them is called InVivo. It's not the only one. Like a good exercise would be to Google, tools to analyze interviews. Right, this is a screenshot from one tool analyzing an interview. And usually what you're doing is you're reading the text, and then you're marking sentences that cover certain topics. You could have a theme that you're looking for, like user experience, and then highlight a sentence that's talking about user experience, give it the theme. And then you can go a level further, like, okay, for all the user experience sentences, I'm going to categorize them into positive and negative. So basically what you're doing is you're taking this natural language, which is very uncertain and fuzzy, and you're trying to quantify it. You're trying to turn it into numerical data. Like, after reading this interview, I've discovered that the person has mentioned negative user experiences 5 million times, which is really surprising, right? You can actually count the number of times some theme was mentioned, and so on. So usually that's called a thematic analysis, looking for recurring themes, repeating patterns, subjects and topics that come up over and over again, which is going to happen, obviously, if you've structured your interview to elicit certain themes and certain topics. And they should be related to whatever hypothesis or topic or question you're trying to answer. And then you use that thematic analysis to try to generate some quantities, not just a summary of the interview. You can specifically say, you know, interviewees discuss the following topic 10% of the time, right, by counting the number of sentences. And here, like, here's a theme that only one person mentioned. You know, out of 10,000 sentences, only one of them mentions this topic. And of course, this process can also be biased. I think everybody in the audience knows that, right? That you can bias natural language processing. You can interview somebody. Well, you can bias everything, you know, to be honest. But you could be having a conversation with somebody that really, really doesn't like Microsoft software. And then they spend 99% of the time saying, I don't like Microsoft software. And then you can ask at the end, is there anything good about Microsoft software? And then quote that one positive sentence, right? And publish that one positive sentence. Okay, so interviews are a very common and important way to elicit narrative information from participants. They're very common. I've done them a lot. In data visualization, we do a lot of interviews, semi-structured interviews, because we're often making software for a very specialized set of users. It's usually specialized. For example, like call center agents or CFD engineers, like a very special audience. So we conduct interviews with them afterwards to find out what their opinions are about what we've developed. And they have different structures, and they look for different topics. And there are a number of different kinds of analyses that can be performed on interview data. So that's just really a short introduction to interviewing. And there are more, if you want to learn more about interviews, like read more about them in depth, there are resources on the Moodle page. If you scroll down to the bottom, did anybody notice that? If you scroll down to the bottom of the Moodle page, there are like additional reading and resources and stuff like that. So following my own advice, are there any questions about interviews? I know we went through that fast, but I think everybody's very familiar with this topic, right? Everybody's probably you've all done an interview, and certainly you have been interviewed, right, at a job or something. Question?
Yeah. So let's say if you're going to develop a software for a computer group, and we need an interview in advance to find out what is the requirement and what is the...
Yeah, that's a great kind of interview, is the requirement specification interview. Yeah, that's a kind of interview. Yeah. And there's a lot of research on this topic. Like you can find typically in human-computer interaction, but not only in visualization too. You can find research papers about gathering requirements analysis. Like, what do you wish? It's typically like asking people, what do you wish existed? Like we have software that doesn't exist yet, but what do you wish existed? Right? I wish that I had. I personally wish that I had software where I could just speak all of my emails and not type them, for example. That would be like a piece of software that doesn't exist yet. Any other questions? So the most mysterious part about interviews is the analysis part. We didn't get into discussions about that, but it's how you analyze the data. That's the most mysterious part. And you know, I'm thinking about like setting up a workshop about something like that, but I haven't gotten that far yet. But that's the most mysterious part. It's like, once you have all that text data, what do you do with it? How do you analyze it? Thematic analysis is one possibility, but there are other kinds of analyses. Does anybody know any other analyses you can perform on text? You can apply visualization methods to text, for example. There's lots of different data visualization methods. You can also apply something called sentiment analysis. Probably some of you have heard of that. Anybody heard of sentiment analysis? That's when you're just looking for how people feel or their opinions on a topic. Like, is it a negative interview? Is there a lot of negative sentiment in this interview, or is there a lot of positive sentiment in this interview, and so on? So there are a multiple, a diverse range of different ways to analyze that data that we don't go into. Okay, so that's interviews. Okay, we're being efficient. I don't want to talk only about interviews today. Focus groups. Focus groups are a little bit more novel, maybe, to you, not as familiar of a topic as interviews. If there are questions or comments, feel free to just interrupt along the way, right away. Anybody know what a focus group is already? So focus groups are a kind of group, I would say you could also call them a group, they're really a group interview. So the lecture on interviews, or the slides on interviews that we just looked at are kind of usually a one-on-one environment. So now it's a one-on-many environment. So one person is kind of interviewing a group, you could say. And then that group, the members of that group have something in common. A typical scenario is they all use a piece of software, right? This class is a focus group, right? You all have a few things in common, right? You're all computer science students, you're all within a certain age, and you're all at the same university, right? You're a focus group, right? That's not necessarily representative of the general populace, and you're all using Moodle, just as not a very exciting example. But if I walk up to somebody in the city center and I start asking them questions about Moodle, probably that's not going to work, right? So we'll focus on what makes focus groups different to one-on-one interviews. So in the first scenario, you're called an interviewer. In the second scenario, you're called a facilitator. You facilitate a discussion. So you are a facilitator, asking questions, getting individual responses from a wide range of people. You target a special group for a more deeper and reflective understanding. Right, and that focus group, they're usually specialists in something. Could be doctors, could be engineers, could be students, but usually they're specialists in something. And then you try to organize their thoughts and organize their feedback. So they have a focus just like interviews do, right? Interviews have a focus too. They're trying to test a hypothesis or gather information about a certain topic. It's the same thing with focus groups. That's something they have in common. And they try to solicit questions, information, opinions, reflections, experiences, ideas, and so on a special topic, right? With a special group of people. They may all have a common experience. It's very often, like I said, related to software. Like maybe you've tested software on 10 different people. Maybe you've developed some software and now you've tested it on 10 different people and you're trying to get their experience, right? They might all have the same job, or they might all have the same interest. You could be having a focus group on a bunch of golf players, like people that play golf or rugby or something like that. It could be first-year international students, right? That's a kind of focus group. So you play the role of facilitator rather than interviewer. That means you, as facilitator, that means you give the focus group a structure. You say, okay, we're going to now get together in groups and we're going to answer the following 5 to 10 questions. Or we're going to discuss this topic and then we're going to answer this set of questions and we're going to repeat that pattern 5 times. Right? So your job is to get people to start communicating in the groups. And then you're trying to solicit specific topics that you want them to communicate about. Right? It's not going to work if everybody's completely silent the whole time. So there's an introduction. You explain the purpose of a session. Has anybody ever participated in a focus group before? Anybody ever done that? What was the focus group? Do you know? Do you remember?
Yeah, we did this in the simulation class.
In the simulation class?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Last semester or this semester? This semester. Okay, that's very good. And what was the scenario? You interviewing somebody, or you split up into groups and you answered questions?
Yeah,
Or
I answered questions.
about simulation?
Yes.
Some simulation software?
Yes.
Okay, that's very good, very good. So yeah, you say how the whole thing is organized, how long it's going to take, and maybe what the goals of the session are, right? For example, we're interested in getting your feedback on Moodle, right? How to improve Moodle. An exciting example. You know, and you might want to explain the purpose, right? We want to inform the next set of features, the next set of Moodle features. And there'll be a structure, right? There'll be like a set of topics to discuss in a special order, and there's usually a duration associated with each topic in question, right? You have 10 minutes to discuss this, 10 minutes for this, and so on. If you don't have that, then it's going to run overtime. And you can include some closed questions and open questions, right? And you can also perform the follow-up questions, like the facilitator also talks to the focus groups, right? It might ask some more questions, right? To solicit more in-depth answers. And so the facilitator provides the structure, right? What topics are going to be discussed, how many topics are going to be discussed, how long those discussions are going to last. If it's a little bit more, if it's like semi-structured, then there'll be some flexibility in the schedule, right? There'll be time to insert new questions into the schedule that aren't planned. And there'll be time to insert, to let the conversation go in a different direction, an unplanned direction. So a really, really good facilitator will give some cushion to the schedule to make it a little bit more flexible. So if the group, and then the other question is how big should the groups be? right? In these focus groups, how big should a group be? Right, if I tried to make this entire class one focus group and have a discussion, it's going to be difficult, right, if the group is too big. So the facilitator has to decide, okay, how do I divide people up into subgroups? You know, if the starting group is too big. Does anybody know how that usually works? Like the subgroup division and choice? That's an advanced question. You'd have to have like experience with subgroups to answer that, focus groups to answer that question. But it's usually like divided by topics of interest. Like, okay, anybody that's interested in doing a dissertation in human-computer interaction, like, go sit over there. That's usually the way it is. Like, the subgroups are split up by interest, like topic of interest. All those that are interested in data viz, like, go over here. You know, all those in AI, go back to the back, and so on. That's usually the way it is. Of course, it's not always that way. And a good facilitator also makes sure that the schedule does not run too far over time, right? Okay, there's an information gathering process in a focus group discussion. How do you collect the feedback from the participants and give it some structure and organization and utility? Do you have your hand up, or are you just holding your pen? Never mind. If you want attention, you can use your pen to do that. So one common method is to use Post-it notes. Like, okay, I have this question. Everybody write your answer down on a Post-it note. You know, that's very common. And then the Post-it notes are usually clustered. So after everybody writes their answers down, the Post-it notes are clustered together and looking for common themes. And there are tools. Has anybody seen these tools that use like the digital Post-it notes? Like, I could use that in this class. I could say, everybody log on to Miro and then write a Post-it note on the following topic, and then you write a digital Post-it note. Like, everybody here noticed I use Google Docs. I like to use Google Docs to get information back and forth from you guys to me and vice versa. I think Google Docs are really good for this purpose. Participants can move and manipulate Post-it notes. I've been in workshops that use virtual Post-it notes and real ones on the wall, where you're sticking your Post-it note on a wall under a specific theme. And there are some virtual Post-it note boards like Miro, Google Jamboard, Teams whiteboards that let you do these things virtually, which is going to be very helpful if you're not physically in the same space. That's very helpful. And of course, the old-fashioned way is to use big sheets of paper. Everybody has seen those big sheets of paper you flip, right? In like TV shows like The Office. I have not actually used the Teams whiteboards and those sorts of this thing. Has anybody used that? The Teams whiteboard or the Teams Post-it notes, those things like that? I haven't actually used those. Maybe I will. Microsoft Forms is another tool to get information back, but it's not actually really collaborative, not really. This is like what a virtual set of Post-it notes, and usually the Post-it notes have a color, and they're colored by theme. right? And usually they're clustered together, right? So all the Post-it notes that address a certain theme might be clustered together under intelligence and so on. This is really for brainstorming. This is a kind of brainstorming activity usually, coming up with new ideas. Okay, and then ending the session, after we've split the groups into subgroups, we're soliciting information from them in the form of text, often text Post-it notes. Could be Google Docs like we do in this class. It's also verbal, right? There's verbal discussion going back and forth between the group members and the facilitator and the people in the focus groups, the participants. Usually somebody is nominated in the subgroup to summarize what they've discussed. Usually that's part of the focus group activity. Like, okay, this subgroup has discussed visualization, dissertation topics and visualization. Tell me what topics you discussed. Like, can you summarize in a few sentences what you discussed? If it's a really good subgroup, really good one, somebody will have taken notes and said, these are the topics we've discussed, and they just have a list of topics they've discussed. And then you thank the participants for attending and present the next steps. And what is the outcome? Well, the outcome changes depending on what you want to get out of it, but of course the Post-it notes are one of the outcomes. The list of topics discussed could be an outcome in a Google Doc, for example. But usually in a research environment, usually there's some sort of a report at the end that tries to summarize the focus group activity. What information you tried to solicit from the participants, how you solicited it from them, and then what information did you get from the focus groups. So like a really, really successful focus group session will actually have a summary report sometime after the event, like a few weeks after the event, that summarizes what happened and what feedback they received, which is difficult, right? You have to synthesize all that random information, well, not random information, but disparate information, and make it cohesive, looking for the common themes and the common patterns. So, for example, if we had a special session on Moodle improvements, and I was trying to set up a focus group on Moodle users, the final outcome would be a report that said, here are our recommendations for the future versions of Moodle features. Right? Here are our recommendations. Like 15 people in the focus group all wish that Moodle would automatically do the coursework for us. Right? That would be an outcome, right? So that's really the goal of a focus group, to have information like that, at the end. And there's a kind of organizational process that happens in focus groups that doesn't happen in one-on-one interviews. And there are variations on this theme, right? The Elton evaluation. You give participants a few minutes to think about a topic, and you ask them to suggest ideas, right? And then we won't get into the details on this, but let's just say that there are variations and specialized versions of focus group activities, right? So in the interest of time, since it's 11:50, we'll stop here. Any questions about focus groups or interviews? Question?
Focus group, would it be like more, would that be a high risk issue, like bias, maybe from one member of the group? How would you stop avoiding that?
That's a very advanced question, actually. So if I understood the question, how would you prevent one person from biasing the discussion too much? I don't have a prepared answer for that. But it's true that some people will have more dominant personalities than others, and some people, like myself, I actually am kind of passive, and I'm actually one of those people that just kind of leans back and watches everybody else, even though it might not look like that right now. And usually I do less talking, and I like more listening, and other people doing the talking. I wouldn't say there's a magic recipe to fix this. I think the most important thing is just as a facilitator to write it down and say, like, here's one participant that really dominated this subgroup, right? And okay, one remedy might be for the facilitator to come in and say, oh, Bob, I noticed you haven't said anything yet. Can you please give us your opinion on this topic? So it would be somehow the facilitator might have to step in and try to balance things out. But it's never going to be perfect, you know. Yeah. Any other questions?
As a student, what's the best way to go about getting a good unbiased set of interviewees? Because in experience, I notice you tend to just ask other students or friends or family, and that's quite biased to your sort of local group.
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly in this context, you want to talk to your supervisor and ask him the same question. In my opinion, one possibility is you try to give an incentive to the participants. Like, if you can give them an incentive, like, I'm going to give you a 10-pound Amazon voucher, then usually you can get participants, a diverse participation. You know what I mean? But if you don't give them some incentive, it might be more bias. You know, like if you're asking a friend, you don't have to offer them an Amazon voucher. You're like, hey, because you're my friend, I want you to do this. So, and same with family. But if you have some incentive, like I'm going to buy, everybody that participates gets a lunch, a free lunch or something, then the chances of you getting a more diverse participation increase. You know, and there might be less bias. Like, so you can get somebody that doesn't know you to participate, and they might be a little bit more honest. You know. But definitely that's something you talk to your supervisor about. And it's an issue. It's a challenge and an issue. No question about that. Any other questions? We should probably wrap up because it's getting late. And I don't know if there's another lecture, but usually there's like the other lecturer coming inside by now. Okay, let's wrap it up. Yeah, thanks everybody.